Dean Mercer stood in the middle of an abandoned hangar at Red Mesa Airfield, surrounded by machines the world had already decided were dead. The helicopters sat in broken rows, dust-layered fuselages, cracked windshields, rotor blades pulled loose and leaned against walls like forgotten oars. The Arizona sun had baked the paint into pale, flaking skin, and the smell of old hydraulic fluid and dry desert air settled over everything like a second coat of rust. Across the hangar floor, men in good boots and expensive sunglasses moved between the wrecks with the casual boredom of people who already knew the answer before the question was asked. Travis Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Aerial Logistics and a man who had never walked through a door without assuming it belonged to him, glanced across the lot, snorted softly, and turned to the group behind him. "Worthless," he said, loud enough for everyone in earshot to hear. "Dead helicopters. Scrap with paperwork." A few men laughed. A few more nodded. Dean did not respond. He crouched beside a machine at the far corner of the hangar, pulled a rag from his back pocket, and wiped a slow circle across a metal plate near the cabin door. A small designation mark appeared through the grime. Warren Hale, standing several feet away, saw it and said nothing. But his expression shifted in a way that only someone paying close attention would notice. 7 days later, the helicopter was pulled onto the floor of Vaughn Aviation Auctions in Scottsdale. The bidding opened at $500,000. It did not stop until the number reached $9 million. Why did the helicopter a billionaire called worthless end up selling for $9 million? Bought by a single father who walked into that hangar with a used pickup truck and a toolbox. Red Mesa Airfield had not operated as a functioning airport in nearly 4 years. The company that had run it, a regional air medical transport firm called Southwest Lifeline Aviation, had filed for bankruptcy after a combination of contract losses and rising fuel costs hollowed out its balance sheet. The county had taken over the property, and the contents of the main hangar had been bundled into a single liquidation auction that drew the kind of crowd that gathers whenever something valuable might be hiding inside something ugly. The hangar held 11 helicopters in total. Most were mid-sized medical transport machines that had logged hard miles between rural clinics and regional trauma centers. Their logbooks were stuffed into a cardboard box near the entrance, and their maintenance records were organized with the casual indifference of a company that had stopped planning for the future sometime in the last year of its operation. Rotor assemblies had been partially disassembled for easier storage. 2 of the machines were missing avionics panels entirely, the components presumably sold off to cover the company's final payroll. From a distance, the lot looked like exactly what Travis Whitmore said it was: a graveyard that happened to have paperwork. Travis had arrived with 2 associates and a reputation. He had built Whitmore Aerial Logistics into one of the largest private helicopter charter networks in the Southwest, and he moved through aviation auctions with the confidence of a man who had bought and sold enough machines to trust his own first impression. He walked the length of the hangar in under 12 minutes, tapped the side of one fuselage with his knuckle as though checking a melon, and announced to his associates that the whole lot was worth pulling for parts. Nothing more. He was not wrong about most of it. But he did not finish the row. He had already decided. The scrap dealers and parts brokers in the room took mental notes. The real estate investor who had wandered in out of curiosity left early. The room began to settle into the quiet arithmetic of people who expected to pay bottom dollar for bottom-tier inventory. Dean Mercer arrived in a gray pickup with 200,000 miles on it and a metal toolbox rattling in the truck bed. He was 38 years old, wore a faded denim jacket over a work shirt, and carried the particular calm of a man who had learned not to waste energy on appearances. He was not a dealer or a speculator. He was a mechanic, specifically a former aviation restoration technician who had spent the better part of a decade working on search and rescue helicopters for a regional contractor before leaving the industry entirely. He had been running a small independent garage for the past 5 years, servicing agricultural equipment and the occasional private aircraft on a contract basis. The garage paid the bills most months. The savings account was thin. He had driven 3 hours from Tucson that morning, on the strength of a listing he had found in an aviation liquidation newsletter that most working mechanics never bothered to subscribe to. He walked the hangar slowly, pausing at each machine. He checked frame welds. He looked at the condition of the attachment points where rotors met mast. He crouched to examine landing gear and stood to examine tail boom geometry. The other buyers gave him a wide berth, the way auction crowds always give wide berth to someone who is clearly not a buyer in the conventional sense. Travis noticed him, said something quietly to one of his associates, and the associate smirked. It was the machine at the back corner of the hangar that stopped Dean. It sat apart from the others, not deliberately, but the way something slightly different always ends up isolated by the unconscious logic of grouping. Its fuselage was longer than the others by what looked like a manufactured section rather than a repair extension. The cabin windows were a different shape. The paint was the same faded institutional white as the rest, but underneath, along the lower seam of the doorframe, Dean could see the ghost of a different color, something darker, more deliberate, pressed beneath the cheap overcoat. He found the serial plate near the cabin door and wiped it clean with the rag from his pocket. The alphanumeric sequence that appeared did not match any of the standard Southwest Lifeline tail numbers. It was a different format entirely. He stood up, looked at the machine for a long moment, then walked to the auction desk and registered his bidder number. When the lot came up, he raised his paddle. Travis watched him, then turned away. The bidding ended with Dean as the buyer. The room made the kind of small collective sound that rooms make when something mildly ridiculous just became official. Warren Hale, standing near the side door, studied the serial plate one more time, quietly memorized the sequence, and left without joining the laughter. Taunfried. Dean trailered the 11 helicopters to a rented hangar space on the outskirts of Tucson over the course of 2 days, borrowing a flatbed from a former colleague for the second run. The hangar was old, a corrugated metal structure that had once served as a crop duster maintenance bay, and it cost him $800 a month he did not comfortably have. By the time the last machine was inside and the rental paperwork was signed, he had used nearly all of the savings he had built up over 3 years of careful, unglamorous work. He stood in the center of the hangar that first evening and did the arithmetic in his head, the way people do when the number is uncomfortable, and they want to make sure they haven't made it worse. He had not, but the margin was narrow. Brooke Ellis from First Mesa Community Bank called him the following morning. She was polite in the way that loan officers are polite when they are also worried, and she reminded him that the balance on his garage equipment line of credit was due in 61 days. She did not ask about the helicopters specifically. She did not know about them yet, but the timing had a weight to it that Dean felt clearly. His son, Nolan, was 15 and old enough to understand that something had shifted. Nolan had come by the hangar after school on the second day, walked the row of machines with his hands in his pockets, and asked with the careful neutrality of someone who already knew the answer was complicated, "Are these the ones people were saying you shouldn't have bought?" Dean told him that people said that about most things that hadn't been explained yet. Nolan looked at the machines. He did not say that was reassuring. But he did not leave either. There was a reason Dean had left helicopter work 5 years earlier, and it was not the kind of reason that fit into a short explanation. His wife, Paige, had been a flight nurse, the kind of person who treated the inside of a helicopter as a natural extension of an emergency room, who moved through turbulence and pressure altitude, and the particular chaos of a nighttime mountain extraction with a steadiness that Dean had never stopped admiring. She had died in a non-aviation accident, a car crash on a two-lane highway outside Flagstaff, on a day when she was not working, not flying, just driving home. The arbitrariness of it had taken years to metabolize. The hardest part, in the aftermath, was that Dean could not be near helicopters without experiencing a kind of bodily conflict. The machines had belonged to Paige's world so completely that being around them felt like reading a letter addressed to someone who no longer existed. He had handed in his technician certification renewal and told himself the break was temporary. The break became permanent. The garage was quieter. The work was different. He had become a different kind of capable, efficient and solitary, reliable in the way of a person who has removed most of the variables from his life. Buying the Red Mesa lot was the first time he had been inside a helicopter hangar in more than 4 years. He had told himself it was a business decision, and that was partly true. But Nolan saw him standing in front of the long fuselaged machine at the back of the rented hangar that third evening. Just standing, not working, not looking at anything specific, and understood without being told that this was something other than business. Dean began the practical work of sorting, which machines had parts worth pulling, which had structural integrity worth preserving, which were irretrievably compromised, and which needed closer examination before a category could be assigned. He worked methodically, the way he had been trained to work. Late on the 4th evening of sorting, he found the secondary compartment on the anomalous helicopter. A panel that did not match the standard interior layout, latched with a non-stock mechanism tucked behind the co-pilot's position. Inside was a logbook. It was old, its cover worn at the corners, its pages dense with entries in 2 different handwriting styles. On the front cover, stamped in faded red ink, were 2 words, Project Meridian. Warren Hale had been a test pilot for 14 years before a rotator cuff injury ended his flight medical and redirected him into aviation consulting and historical documentation. He was 61, precise in the way of someone who had spent a career where imprecision had consequences, and he knew the name Project Meridian the way that people who pay very close attention to obscure aviation history know the names of programs that were quietly canceled before they could become famous. Dean called him the morning after finding the logbook, and Warren was at the Tucson hangar by noon. He spent 40 minutes with the logbook before he said anything. When he did speak, he chose his words with the care of someone who did not want to be responsible for what those words might set in motion. Project Meridian had been a private development program operated by a now-dissolved manufacturer during the early 2000s. The concept was specific: take a proven medium-lift civilian helicopter platform and reconfigure it, structurally and avionically, to serve a hybrid function as both a long-range medical evacuation aircraft and a high-endurance VIP transport. The reconfiguration involved a fuselage extension, a secondary fuel system, a rapid conversion interior that could shift from full medical suite to executive cabin in under 2 hours, and a modified avionics package designed for extended autonomous navigation over wilderness terrain. The program had produced 3 prototypes before the parent company ran out of development funding and folded the entire division into a merger. The hangar records were absorbed into the acquiring company's archives. 2 of the 3 prototypes were accounted for. One had been sold to a private buyer in Canada. One had been dismantled for parts documentation. The third had disappeared into the paperwork chaos of the merger and was presumed lost. Aviation historians had noted its absence in 2 separate retrospective articles. The aviation community had essentially agreed, by quiet consensus, that Unit 3 was gone. The logbook Dean had found was not for Unit 3. It was for Unit 2, the one everyone believed had been dismantled. The entries in the logbook detailed its entire history from initial assembly through 2 periods of active testing, a transfer of ownership to a medical contractor in the Southwest, and a final entry dated 6 years prior, noting a scheduled maintenance check that had apparently never been completed. The machine had then passed through 2 more transactions, both informal, both poorly documented, before ending up in the Southwest Lifeline fleet, where it had presumably been treated as a standard transport helicopter by people who had no idea what they actually owned. Warren pointed out each physical marker that confirmed the logbook's claims. The extended fuselage section, the auxiliary fuel cell housing behind the main tank access panel, the rapid conversion seat rail system, the modified instrument panel that still bore the wiring harness for the experimental navigation package, and, most significantly, the original factory paint color visible beneath the utility white, a deep charcoal gray that matched the Meridian program's documented livery exactly. "If you're wrong," Warren told Dean, setting the logbook down carefully, "you have an unusual medical helicopter with interesting modifications and a plausible but unverifiable history." He paused. "If you're right, Travis Whitmore just laughed at one of the most significant lost prototypes in regional aviation history." Dean was quiet for a moment. He was not thinking about Travis. He was thinking about the logbook, specifically about the entries written in the second handwriting style, which were shorter and more practical in tone, less technical and more human, the kind of entries a pilot writes rather than an engineer. He had read them twice. He recognized a familiarity in the rhythm of the writing, the way someone writes when they care about the machine they are flying. He decided he wanted to give the machine the chance to be what it actually was. He had 7 days before the next major Vaughn Aviation Auctions event in Scottsdale. Warren told him that if he could get the helicopter onto that floor with proper documentation, the right buyers would be in the room. Dean said he needed to make some calls. Warren took a photograph of the serial plate. That afternoon, he sent it to Naomi Pierce, an aviation history journalist, whose column on lost and recovered aircraft had a following that extended well beyond the enthusiast community. Naomi looked at the photograph for approximately 40 seconds and then called Warren back to ask when she could come see the machine in person. Vaughn Aviation Auctions was one of 3 premium aviation auction houses in the country, and its Scottsdale event drew buyers from across North America and Europe. Claire Vaughn had built the firm over 20 years by being more careful than her competitors. She required documentation, she employed in-house appraisers, and she turned away consignments that could not be verified to her standard. The firm's reputation was the product of that discipline, and Claire was not interested in compromising it for the sake of an interesting story. When Dean called to request a consignment slot, his call was handled first by a scheduling assistant and then escalated, at Dean's insistence, to Tyler Knox, the firm's chief appraiser. Tyler had been with Vaughn for 9 years, had personally authenticated hundreds of aircraft, and operated with the efficient skepticism of someone who had been approached by optimistic amateurs more times than he could count. His response was brief and not unkind. "We don't put hangar salvage on the premium floor." Dean asked to speak with Claire directly. Claire took the call because Warren Hale had sent her an email the previous evening that she had read 3 times. Claire gave Dean 7 days to produce documentation sufficient for a preliminary appraisal review. The standard she described was high: provenance trail, physical conformity to claimed specifications, corroborating expert testimony, and photographic evidence of the specific identifying features. If the documentation met her threshold, she would send Tyler for a physical inspection. If the inspection cleared, the helicopter would be listed. If either stage failed, the consignment would be declined, and Dean would have spent a week of hard work on a result he already feared. He told her he understood and thanked her for the time. Then he went back to the hangar, put on a work light, and started. The 7 days had a quality that Dean would later describe as the most focused he had been since the first years of his marriage. Not because the work was easy, but because it was exactly the kind of problem that rewards the specific combination of technical knowledge and patient attention that he had spent his entire adult life developing. He cleaned the fuselage section by section, photographing each area before and after. He pulled the auxiliary fuel cell housing and documented its constructions against the Meridian program specifications that Warren had obtained from a university aviation archive. He traced the wiring harness for the experimental navigation package and found that 60% of the original components were still in place, removed by none of the helicopter's subsequent owners, because none of them had known they were looking at anything other than standard avionics. He cross-referenced every logbook entry against maintenance records from the Southwest Lifeline cardboard box, finding 7 specific instances where the helicopter had been serviced differently from the rest of the fleet, scheduled check items that did not apply to standard machines but were correct for the Meridian configuration. On the 3rd day, working on the interior panel replacement, he removed a trim section that had been poorly resecured by a previous technician and found a small manufacturer's plate riveted to the structural frame behind it. The plate read, Meridian S-76 Rescue VIP Prototype, Unit 2. He sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Then he called Nolan. Nolan came after school and helped his father photograph every page of the logbook under a portable light panel, working until close to midnight. At one point, Nolan looked up from the scanning work and said that his father did not need to prove anything to the billionaire who had laughed at the auction. Dean told him he was not trying to prove anything to Travis Whitmore. He was trying to give the machine back its name, to make sure it was correctly identified before it changed hands, so that whatever it became next, it would become it honestly. Nolan thought about that for a while and went back to the scanning. Travis Whitmore had heard about the Meridian angle through the kind of informal aviation industry network that operates on the same information channels as rumor, but tends to be faster and more accurate. He arrived at Dean's hangar on the 5th day, unannounced, in a black SUV that he did not park with any particular consideration for the space it occupied. His manner had shifted. The casual dismissal of the auction was still in his bearing, but it had been joined by something tighter, the controlled energy of a man recalibrating a mistake he had not yet admitted to himself. He offered Dean $50,000 for the helicopter, framed as a favor. Dean declined. Travis offered $200,000 and shifted his language to something closer to reasonable, acknowledging that Dean had done some interesting research, suggesting that a clean exit was the sensible choice given that the authentication process was expensive and uncertain. Dean told him that the interesting part was not the research. The interesting part was that Travis had called it worthless in front of 40 people 3 days earlier, and was now offering $200,000 for it. Travis's expression tightened. He said Dean did not have the resources to carry this through. Dean agreed that he did not have abundant resources. He said he had the logbook, the serial documentation, photographs of the identifying features, corroboration from a former test pilot, and the truth, which tended to be a fairly durable asset. Travis left without further negotiation. Claire and Tyler arrived for the physical inspection on the 6th day. Tyler walked the machine with the efficient movement of someone who has learned to read aircraft the way other people read faces. Quickly, skeptically, looking for the place where the story breaks down. He found no place where it broke down. The conformity between the physical evidence and the documentation was not the approximate conformity of a well-constructed forgery. It was the exact conformity of something that was simply what it claimed to be. He did not revise his manner. He remained cool and professional, But he stopped generating objections partway through the inspection, and Claire, watching him, noted the change. Naomi Pierce had, that same morning, published a short piece in her column noting that a lost Meridian prototype had been reported at a private facility in Tucson pending authentication, and that, if the report was accurate, it would represent one of the most significant aircraft rediscoveries in the program's documented history. The piece was read that afternoon by several thousand people, including the Director of Acquisitions for the Pacific Aviation Museum, 3 private collectors known to specialize in prototype and experimental aircraft, and the Development Director for a nonprofit aviation preservation trust whose board included Warren Hale. Claire called Dean that evening. The helicopter would be listed. The Scottsdale event occupied a converted exhibition space on the north side of the city, a venue that Vaughn Aviation used twice a year and had spent considerable effort making look like the kind of place where serious transactions happen. The ceiling was high, the lighting was deliberate, and the floor space was arranged to give each consignment room to breathe. Aviation auctions at the premium level were not warehouse sales, and Claire's firm had cultivated an atmosphere that communicated the difference. The crowd for this event was larger than typical. Word of the Meridian listing had circulated through the collector community with the efficiency of genuinely interesting information, and several buyers who did not normally attend the Scottsdale event had made arrangements to be present. Travis Whitmore was in the VIP section, positioned with the practiced casualness of someone who wanted to appear indifferent while watching very closely. Tyler Knox stood near the side wall, performing a last-round check on his consignment notes. Warren sat 3 rows back from the floor, his expression composed and still. Nolan had asked to come. Dean had said yes. The helicopter was brought onto the floor on a dolly by 2 technicians, positioned under the main lighting cluster, and left to stand as it was. Not polished, not artificially restored, but clean and honest, its logbook displayed on a stand beside it, its serial plate clearly visible, its modified fuselage unmistakably different from the standard configuration of any helicopter most people in the room had seen before. The projection screen above showed a brief documentary sequence, photographs of the Meridian program, original manufacturer's drawings, excerpts from the archived documentation, a timeline of the prototype's movements through the Southwest Lifeline fleet, and the discovery sequence, Dean's photographs, the hidden plate, the logbook entries. Claire introduced the lot in 3 sentences. She said it was a prototype that had been called worthless by someone who had not examined it, and that it had since been confirmed as a missing piece of aviation rescue history. She said the floor was open. The opening bid was $500,000. The number was met immediately, and then the room began to move. $1 million came within 90 seconds. $2.5 million arrived as 3 separate bidders found their positions and began competing with the focused rhythm of people who had come prepared to spend. At $4 million, the field narrowed to the Pacific Aviation Museum's acquisitions director, a private collector named Richard Farwell, who had reportedly been looking for a Meridian-related piece for 6 years, and a consortium representative for the Hale Meridian Museum and Rescue Trust, the nonprofit preservation organization that Warren had helped establish. Travis Whitmore entered the bidding at $4,500,000, raising his paddle with an expression that was carefully neutral but communicated clearly to anyone paying attention that he was not there because he cared about the history. He was there because he had been wrong in public and wanted to convert the mistake into ownership before the room finished witnessing it. At $6 million, Travis dropped out. His paddle went down with a controlled precision that suggested he had set a limit and was maintaining it, and he sat back with his arms folded and watched the remaining 3 bidders work. The Pacific Aviation Museum held to $7 million, And then their acquisitions director made a small, almost imperceptible gesture to the person beside him. The kind of gesture that means the ceiling has been reached, and they, too, withdrew. Richard Farwell and the Hale Trust Consortium pushed past 7, past 8, and approached 9 million with the incremental aggression of a negotiation that both parties wanted to end on their own terms. The room had the particular silence of a crowd that has stopped talking because it wants to hear clearly. Naomi Pierce was near the back, writing in a small notebook. Dean stood to the side of the floor, not at his seat. He was watching the helicopter, not the bidding board. Nolan stood beside him and said nothing. The gavel came down at $9 million. The buyer was the Hale Meridian Museum and Rescue Trust. The room produced the specific sound that rooms produce when an outcome has exceeded what most people expected. Not a cheer exactly, but a release of accumulated tension that has the shape of applause. Travis Whitmore sat for a moment without moving. Then he stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the exit at a pace slightly faster than his usual. Tyler Knox, standing by the wall, looked at the number on the display board with the expression of someone doing arithmetic they already know the answer to and not enjoying the result. A journalist from an aviation trade publication approached Dean with a recorder and asked how he felt about selling, for $9 million, a helicopter that a billionaire had called worthless. Dean said he had not made it valuable. It had always been what it was. He had only made sure that the wrong person did not get to finish defining it. The Hale Meridian Museum and Rescue Trust had a specific plan for the helicopter, and it was not the plan of an institution that wanted to put something impressive in a glass case and lock the door. The trust was a collaboration between 3 regional aviation museums and a nonprofit that funded helicopter rescue operations in remote wilderness areas, a combination that Warren had quietly engineered over the previous 2 years as the right organizational structure for preserving the Meridian program's legacy in a context that connected the machines to their original purpose. The trust committed, publicly and in contractual terms, to a full structural restoration of Unit 2, a documented exhibition of the Project Meridian history that would tour 3 of their member facilities, and a communications program tied to the exhibition that would raise money for active wilderness rescue operations in the Southwest. The helicopter would not disappear into a private collection. It would be identified, explained, and connected to something living. Dean took a long weekend before he made any decisions about the money. He walked the Tucson hangar by himself on a Saturday morning and stood for a while near the remaining machines in the lot. The $9 million was real. He had confirmation from the escrow account, but it had a quality that he did not entirely trust himself to respond to correctly in the first several days, the way a sudden change in light can make you doubt your eyes before they adjust. The debts were straightforward. The garage equipment line that Brooke Ellis had called about, a smaller personal credit balance, the hangar rent, and several vendor accounts he had been slow paying for the past year. He paid them all within the week. The garage was now fully owned. The rented hangar had a 12-month extension. And then he sat with the remainder and thought about what Paige would have done with it. Paige would have found the use that made the money an instrument rather than a destination. He established the Paige Mercer Air Rescue Scholarship, a fund to support training for young aviation maintenance technicians who wanted to work in medical or rescue aviation, administered through a regional technical college that had a working relationship with 2 search and rescue operators in Arizona and New Mexico. He purchased a set of training equipment for the hangar, proper diagnostic tools, an airframe simulator section, materials for structured instruction. He reached out to the technical college about a part-time instructional arrangement, and the department chair said yes before Dean had finished explaining what he was proposing. He kept a specific amount in reserve for what he had already begun thinking of as the next project. one of the other helicopters in the lot, a smaller and older machine that a preliminary inspection suggested had more structural integrity than its condition implied. He did not touch that money. Travis Whitmore approached Dean in the parking lot outside the venue after the auction. His manner had returned to something like courtesy, carefully calibrated, several degrees cooler than warmth but not hostile. He said that Dean had done something impressive and that there might be opportunity for collaboration going forward, given Dean's evident skill in identifying undervalued aviation assets. Dean thanked him for the compliment. He told Travis that what Travis was describing was not collaboration. It was proximity to a result that Travis had initially excluded himself from by deciding too quickly. He said it without cruelty, simply and directly, the way someone states a fact that does not require emotional accompaniment. Travis nodded, slowly, and walked to his car. Claire had a longer conversation with Tyler Knox after the auction, the kind of conversation that a principal has with a senior employee when a pattern needs to be addressed, rather than a single incident. Tyler had not falsified anything or acted improperly in any procedural sense, but he had consistently treated Dean's submission as a nuisance rather than a claim worth evaluating, not because the evidence was weak, but because of the person presenting it, the condition of the machine when first seen, and the informal circumstances of its discovery. Claire told him that their firm's standard was the quality of the evidence, not the quality of the presenter's background or the first impression of the inventory. Tyler accepted this. He remained with the firm, and his appraisal process became measurably more thorough for consignors who did not arrive with the conventional markers of established industry standing. Claire called Dean separately and told him she was sorry for the resistance he had encountered during the submission process. Dean told her that resistance was a reasonable response to an unusual claim, and that his issue had never been with people who wanted to verify his work. His issue was with the specific posture of dismissal before verification, the assumption of worthlessness made before the examination had happened. Claire said she understood the distinction. Dean said he thought she did. Nolan had watched the auction number climb with an expression that cycled quietly between disbelief and something quieter. A recognition, perhaps, that his father's steadiness had not been stubbornness after all, or had been stubbornness in the way that all genuine conviction looks from the outside. That evening, when they were driving back toward Tucson with the radio off, Nolan asked whether his father was worried that the money would change things. Dean drove for a moment without responding. Then he said that money changes the account balance, and that if it changed the reason for anything he did, that would be a failure of his, not a consequence of the money. He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said most important things. Several months passed, and the Tucson hangar became something it had not been before. Not a storage facility, not a salvage operation, but a working space with a specific purpose and a named reason for existing. Dean and Nolan refinished the interior panels. New lighting went up. The first training cohort for the Page Mercer Scholarship Program was 8 students, young technicians between 19 and 24 years old, from backgrounds that ranged from community college aviation programs to military surplus mechanics accounts who had transitioned out and were looking for a more specialized path. They came 3 evenings a week and on Saturday mornings, and Dean taught them the way he had learned. Slowly, by hand, with real machines and no shortcuts. The hangar smelled like aviation again, solvent and metal and the particular neutral odor of composite material being worked correctly, and Dean found that this time the smell did not carry the complicated freight it once had. It had become something else. Brooke Ellis came by the hangar one afternoon, not in a professional capacity, but with a small apology that she had clearly been carrying for a while. She said that when she had called about the line of credit that fall, she had not known what Dean was working on, but she also acknowledged that she had not asked. Dean invited her in and showed her the training setup. She stayed for an hour and asked genuine questions about the scholarship program. She left with the number for the Technical College's development office, which she said she intended to call. Naomi Pierce's documentary was in early production, built around the discovery story but expanding outward to cover the Meridian program itself, the economics of aviation liquidation, and a broader argument about how institutional assumptions about value tend to reflect the assumptions of the people with institutional power rather than the qualities of the things being assessed. Naomi interviewed Dean for 3 hours, and he answered everything directly and without embellishment. The documentary was not scheduled to air for several more months, but advance interest in the distribution community was substantial. The remaining 10 helicopters from the Red Mesa lot had been processed in the months following the auction. 3 had yielded significant parts sold to certified repair stations. 2 were genuine structural losses and were sold as scrap at fair market rates, which Dean documented and reported without inflating. 4 were sold whole to buyers who had approached him directly after the auction, mechanics, small operators, a flight school in New Mexico, at prices that reflected their actual condition. The 10th machine was the one Dean had set aside from the beginning, the smaller and older helicopter that had been sitting in the back row of his mental accounting since the first week. It was a different model from the Meridian prototype. Older, simpler, configured for agricultural support rather than rescue work, and it had been beaten by years of low-altitude agricultural work in a way that showed in its airframe stress points and rotor head components. But its fundamental structure was sound. Dean had confirmed this himself on 3 separate inspections. The afternoon when Warren Hale came to see how the training program was going, the light over Red Mesa was doing what Arizona light does near sunset, going golden and horizontal in a way that makes the ordinary look briefly significant. Warren walked the hangar, watched a student working on a fuel cell assembly with focused patience, and then followed Dean outside to where the small helicopter sat on the apron beside the building. It had been partially disassembled for inspection, its cowlings off, its rotor head laid aside carefully, its interior cleaned to a degree that let you see the bones of the machine without distraction. Warren stood beside it and looked it over with the professional eye he never quite turned off. He asked Dean if he was planning to sell it. Dean looked at the rotor assembly, then up at the strip of sky visible above the hangar roofline, the kind of sky that late afternoon in the desert produces, wide and clear and very blue. He said that this one he was not planning to sell. He said he wanted to hear it fly. Warren looked at him for a moment, then looked at the machine, and did not say anything further on the subject. Claire, who had driven out from Scottsdale for a meeting about a future consignment arrangement, was standing in the doorway of the hangar when Dean said it. She did not call attention to herself. She just listened and allowed herself a small, quiet smile that she did not explain to anyone. In the months that followed, the lights in the hangar at the edge of Tucson stayed on past dark 3 nights a week. There was the sound of tools, the specific, purposeful sound of someone working on something they understand, and voices, the back and forth of instruction and question, and the kind of laughter that happens when people are concentrating hard and something goes right. Above the main door, a hand-lettered sign on a piece of aircraft-grade aluminum had been mounted by Nolan on a Saturday afternoon. It read, "Page Mercer Air Rescue Scholarship Hangar." The letters were clean and even, pressed into the metal with a stamp set that had taken Nolan 40 minutes to borrow from the tool cabinet and 2 hours to get right. Dean had looked at it for a long time when Nolan put it up. He had not said whether it was what he expected. He had said it was right. The helicopter that Travis Whitmore had called worthless had become a documented artifact in a museum restoration facility its fuselage stripped to bare metal for the first time in decades, its original charcoal gray paint re-emerging under careful hands, its logbook sealed in archival housing for permanent preservation. Unit 2 of Project Meridian was being restored to what it had actually been, not what it had spent decades masquerading as, not what a man in good boots had decided it was in a 12-minute walk through a dusty hangar. And in a rented bay in Tucson, under honest lights, with 8 students who were learning to read machines the way Dean had learned to read them, a smaller and quieter helicopter was being taken apart and put back together again with the specific kind of attention that things deserve when someone has decided, finally, that they are worth it. The $9 million had been the proof, but it had never been the point. The point was the serial plate under the dust, the name that had always been there, waiting for someone to stop assuming and start looking. The point was the logbook that had survived a bankruptcy, a merger, 2 informal transactions, and years of institutional indifference. The point was a single father who had driven 3 hours in a truck with 200,000 miles on it, because he knew, in the specific way that experience and attention and caring about your work produces a kind of knowledge that cannot be faked, that you do not call something dead until you have actually looked.